you, Kate. So I just want to start out with making a statement that the information that we can share at this time is limited to what was discussed in open court or that is included in any public documents. Obviously, the affidavit supporting the arrest was released by the court today, but because that document gets into specific facts about the investigation, we will not address the affidavit itself nor any of the information contained therein. Obviously, we had previously released the charges that both John Halford and Carrie Halford are facing. At John Halford's preliminary hearing today, evidence was presented only on the money laundering charges, and that can be confusing. I know it was confusing to some of the affected family members. In Colorado, defendants are entitled to a preliminary hearing in specific instances. Those instances include when a defendant is in custody on pending felony charges, or when a defendant is in or out of custody on felony charges that require mandatory DOC sentencing, or finally, when a defendant is in or out of custody on felony charges that are a Class 3 or higher felony offense. Mr. Halford obviously bonded out of custody, so he was entitled to a preliminary hearing only on the money laundering counts, which are counts 1 through 4, as they are all Class 3 felony offenses. Procedurally, all of the counts charged in the complaint against John Halford are bound over for trial, and the court made that ruling today. Both defendants are scheduled for an arraignment on March 21st, 2024 at 9 a.m. Arraignment is a procedural step when a defendant enters a formal guilty or not guilty plea. It's very typical for a defendant to enter a not guilty plea at that setting, and we anticipate that to be the case for these two defendants. It's important to note, as always, that despite the charges being bound over for both defendants, that they are both still presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I want to take this opportunity now to remind the public that some of the remains recovered from the location in Penrose have not been identified. A number of people continue to work diligently to identify those remains, including the Fremont County Coroner's Office. To date, 22 bodies remain unidentified. If you or someone you know conducted business with Return to Nature from January 2019 through October 2023, and you are concerned that your family member or friend may be unidentified, please send an email to Penrose Funeral Home, spelled out, at fbi.gov. All emails sent to that address will be responded to with a link to fill out a questionnaire. There is also a hotline that people can use, a local phone number, 719-472-3856. Calls to that number will be receiving a return call with more information. I want to end my prepared statements with the same admonition I made earlier, and that is that all defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and despite the ruling today in court, that still holds true for these two defendants. With that, I want to be sure that we understand that I'm going to be very limited in the things that I talk about. I'm not going to get into the facts of the case. Really just want to talk about any procedural questions that any of you may have. Let's start over here, Colette.
If the two defendants hypothetically plead not to arraignment, would they be tried together as co-defendants in trial?
Yeah, so one of the statements that we made in the at the conclusion of Carrie Halford's preliminary hearing is that we do want them to be paired up so that we can do a joint trial. Zach?
Are you optimistic that you'll be able to identify the final 22 bodies?
We're hopeful. It's going to take some very diligent work, continuing diligent work from the coroner's office down in Fremont County. It's going to take diligent effort on the part of community members also to get them the information they need to make a good identification. Melissa?
Have you ruled out the possibility of offering a plea deal to either one of the Halfords?
Yeah, that's not even part of our calculus at this particular juncture. And if we do engage with that, we'll obviously talk to the affected family members before we talk with the defense attorneys. But that's something I'm not going to comment on right now. Zach?
Do you think bond will be readdressed for John Halford in the future?
Potentially. That's always a potential in any criminal case. That typically, and I'm going to talk in a generalized sense here, that would typically happen if circumstances change, that either the prosecution or defense wants to then readdress bond, and that can happen. And it's a very routine thing to happen in any case. Whether it will happen in John Halford's case or not is to be seen, and really not something I want to get into too much detail about. And I'm not doing a very good job of repeating questions, so hopefully everybody's getting the actual questions.
Just to say, you said that if you were to, let residents know if you or somebody, use their business, you use the date January
Exactly. It's just to cast a wide enough net that we can hopefully identify those bodies. And the question was, why am I picking January 2019? It's just to cast a wide net so that we can hopefully identify those last 22 remaining bodies.
I know 189 physical bodies were found, but also in Carrie's hearing, we heard that a water cremation machine was found. Is there any looking into the potential that more bodies might have been victimized? We just don't know where or in what way?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into speculation that I don't think is helpful for the case proceeding at this particular point. It's a great question, Melissa, but I'm just not going to get into that right now.
But it is accurate that they had several more clients than 189 over the course of 4 years, correct?
Again, that's getting into speculation. That doesn't really get to the charges that we've charged in this particular case. If they had obviously worked with more families and they're not included in the charges, that just means that there's no evidence that there's any criminal conduct with those other folks. Yeah. Colette.
Less procedural, more emotional impact of this
Mhm.
case on your office as you meet with all these families, as you present the evidence in the court. How has this case differed from others? And I'm not meaning that as a compare and contrast, but this case has so many victims. It's in a realm that we don't often see within the courtroom.
Yeah, so what Colette's asking is what's the emotional impact on people that are involved with the case, essentially. Obviously, this is a big community impact case. It affects people in both El Paso County and Fremont County. We have family members locally and otherwise that are hugely impacted by this case. And to your point, we deal with these types of high-profile cases in the same way, which is trying to be empathetic to the affected family members, doing the best that we can in court, and putting together the best prosecution teams that we can to put ourselves in a really good position on any given case, and that's definitely true of this case. These two prosecutors are top-notch and some of our best in this office.
Are there
Yeah.
any bodies that unfortunately have not been paired up with loved ones yet that haven't been claimed?
Well, that's what I was referring to. Those 22 unidentified remains would fit into that category.
But are there any that have been identified that investigators?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So some probably have been identified, and again, I don't want to get into too many specifics, but maybe haven't been paired up with a particular family. That's definitely true, but I'm not going to get into the numbers or who those folks might be. Zach?
Do you think this case will be taken to trial this year?
Oh, that's a big speculation. Good question. Zach's asking if this case will make it to trial this year. The courts move slow when we get into criminal prosecution. We're hopeful that it would happen in a relatively short amount of time, but things happen in cases, and we'll just have to see how that plays out.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you can answer this or not. Could there be any federal charges too, especially with a military burial that was out at the cemetery, federal cemetery?
Yeah. So what Mike is asking is there a potential for any federal charges? That would be a speculative answer right now, so I'm not going to get into that.
The federal, has the FBI or anybody contacted you?
Well, the FBI obviously testified in this preliminary hearing, so they're certainly aware of all of the facts in this case.
I have a question, just since you're not too sure about when the trial will be, and you're kind of saying it might be a long process, like, is there any concerns in terms of John Halford evading law enforcement again, since he did it once before while he's in bail?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into a speculative area. Good question. So the question was, are there any concerns about John Halford potentially fleeing the area, essentially? I'm not going to get into the speculation. It's a good question, certainly something that I can understand why you'd be interested in an answer on that. But because it's so speculative and not something that is a big concern right now, I'm not going to get into it. But thank you. Yeah, Melissa.
Are there any major differences or any differences at all in how you're proceeding with John's case versus Carrie's case at this time?
So the question is, are we treating the two cases differently? And the answer is no. The only difference is the procedural difference between when Carrie Halford's preliminary hearing happened. She was in custody, so we presented evidence to support all of the felony charges, whereas for John Halford, he was out of custody, so he was only entitled to a preliminary hearing on the money laundering charges, so those Class 3 felony offenses. Procedurally, that's the only difference. The approach to both cases is the same.
Can you clarify why that is? Because I wasn't totally clear on why they just addressed like the money laundering evidence today, whereas Carrie's was more like the...
Yeah, so that's the question is, if I can clarify why preliminary hearing evidence was presented on John Halford for only the Class 3 felonies. That's the statement that I made early on in my comments about the procedural makeup in Colorado. Defendants are entitled to a preliminary hearing on felony charges if they're in custody, no matter what the level of charges are. If they're in or out of custody and the felony charge is a mandatory sentence to DOC, that would give a preliminary hearing no matter what level they are. And then finally, if a person is in or out of custody and the charges are a Class 3 or higher felony offense. Money laundering is a Class 3, so that's why we did the preliminary hearing on just those money laundering. And that's a weird thing with Colorado procedure as it relates to preliminary hearing. I know it caused a lot of confusion for affected family members. I'm sure people in the public will be confused about that, but it's just a weird quirk in the law.
When we were here for the previous press conference after their arrest, I know you kind of wanted to make clear to everybody very early on that pretty much they could potentially be all probation eligible charges, but obviously the way you described it, this one or those Class 3 felonies do require, I guess, require the hearing because they can carry those minimum.
Yeah, so the question is, I think if I'm hearing your question correctly, is hearkening back to my early comments that all of the potential charges here are probation eligible, and then contrasting that with why John Halford had preliminary hearing on Class 3 felony. Is that it? So even the Class 3 felonies on those money laundering charges, those are not mandatory DOC. It's just because of the level of the charges that they're Class 3. These are all still potentially probation eligible offenses. Nothing about this process changes that at all. And that's just Colorado law. Yes.
What the challenges are that the coroner's office is facing in identifying those last 22 bodies?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into those details. I think that gets too close to the investigation. It's a good question, though. Melissa's asking what challenges is the coroner's office having to identify those last 22 bodies, and it's just too close to the investigation to get into those details. With that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Great questions. Thank you all for participating and getting the message out to the community about those remaining 22 bodies. We do want to get those folks identified so that we can connect them up with their affected family members and bring some closure for those people. Thank you.